So good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's discussion about Poland, a Green Land. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Now in its 25th year, the museum is committed to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope that you'll visit the museum in person to see our new core exhibition, The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do, alongside our temporary exhibition, Survivors, Faces of Life After the Holocaust, from photographer Martin Scholler. You can learn more and find tickets on our website. We also appreciate the vital support of our members so much here at the museum. If you want to get closer to the museum and enjoy exclusive programs, member previews to exhibitions, and free admission, you can explore museum membership on our website or email membership@mjhnyc.org to learn more. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off will be posted in the chat, in addition to all the links I've mentioned. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Today, we are honored to be joined by Altie Karper and Philip Hollander. Altie is the editorial director of Schocken Books, an imprint of Penguin Random House LLC. Authors with whom she has worked include Aharon Applefeld, Robert Gottlieb, Irving Howe, Francine Klagsbrun, Rabbi Harold Kushner, Deborah Lipstadt, Arthur Miller, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Elie Wiesel, and Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg. Philip currently teaches Hebrew language and culture at Princeton University. A scholar of modern Hebrew literature and culture, he previously taught at Cornell, Tulane, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is the author of From Schlemiel to Sabra, Zionist Masculinity and Palestinian Hebrew Literature, and has written numerous articles on American Hebrew literature and Israeli film and literature. You can pre-order Poland, a Green Land at the link in the Zoom chat. So thank you so much for joining us today. And now I'm going to hand things over to Altie and Philip.
Thank you, Sydney. I'm going to be here doing some questions to Altie about the book. She's been involved with it much more recently. And before we jump into a book which many of you are not fully familiar with, I'm going to ask Altie some questions that will help us to contextualize Applefeld within Israeli culture and within Israeli literature as a whole. So I'm going to start out. I'll give my question to Altie. Okay, yesterday was Israel's 75th birthday, Independence Day. And I'm interested if you could speak to the question of Applefeld and his literary works placed within the broader context provided by the history of the state of Israel and its literature.
Sure. I think that Aharon Applefeld is unique among Israeli writers. He was a Holocaust survivor who immigrated to Israel after the war, so he doesn't really fall into the first generation, the Aliyah Bet writers such as Yosef Chaim Brenner and Shmuel Yosef Agnon. He's not in that cohort, but he is also not in the cohort of the Israeli writers with which a lot of our audience would be familiar, the younger Israeli-born American writers, Amos Oz, Aleph Beis Yehoshua, Essi Yitzhar, Moshe Shamir, David Grossman. He's quite unique, and you would probably know this better than I, but I'm just trying to think of any other Israeli fiction writer who came to Israel as a Holocaust survivor after the war. I just throw this back to you. Is Applefeld unique in that respect, or are there others that you can think of?
I mean, there are a lot of Israeli writers who actually arrived in Israel. In terms of a Holocaust survivor, Applefeld would be grouped among the child survivors of the Holocaust. And he's not someone who experienced the camps. And this is something that differentiates him. And when we're talking about survivors, there are different ways of thinking about who is a survivor and what is survived. If we do a more expansive sort of version of Holocaust survivors, the person who I think might actually surprisingly be placed alongside of him would be the poet and prose writer Yehuda Amichai.
Right.
I, as a young child, made Aliyah from Germany, and his family was encountering some serious anti-Semitism in Germany, and his parents decided to leave. And this experience was very powerful, had a powerful effect on him. And he has an important novel called Not of This Time and Not of This Place, which has one of his personas returning to his childhood home, and it goes through the traumas which are related to the people he left behind, many of whom died, and that these are people who don't experience what are the quintessential camp-based version of survival, like someone like Primo Levi, but these people, their lives are changed and permanently by the Holocaust. So they were approximately contemporaries, and they arose at the same time. So he's the one who I would group him most closely with.
Interesting. Because I was looking through Aharon's oeuvre, and of all of his works, well, I'm familiar with the half that have been published in the English language. We say on our author bios that he is the author of more than 20 works of fiction and nonfiction. A bit more than 20 have been published in English. And of those, actually only 3 are set in Israel: The Immortal Bartfuss, The Men Who Never Stopped Sleeping, Suddenly Love, and then there's his memoir. So he is an Israeli and he's a writer, but I guess the question is, how do you define an Israeli writer in terms of their content and in terms of who they are? So I think that's where his uniqueness actually comes to the fore in what he's writing about, as opposed to what his predecessors and the people who came after him write about. So that would be my long answer to your short question.
Okay, so that you believe that Applefeld, it's his content that sets him apart from other Israeli authors, and I think that when you were talking about authors from the early state period, like Moshe Shamir or even Samech Yizhar, that many Israelis in the late 40s and in the 50s, their focus was primarily on the state of Israel and its landscape. And Applefeld, even when in his earliest collection, which is largely unpublished, called Smoke, he starts to deal with the Israeli landscape. He starts to deal with people at the margins. And while he was a young man, he couldn't help but notice the Holocaust survivors who were populating the country in high numbers and who were living on its margins, and sort of their efforts to come together with Israel. But most of his corpus, especially what is translated, deals with things which take place in the Carpathian Mountains or in Transnistria or places around Chernovitz, which were not in the 50s and the 60s places that most Israeli writers decided to set their work. And his movement back into the past, when Israel was very present, interested in its present moment, it definitely sets him apart. So I definitely, I see where you're coming from. Now that we're talking about one work and you gave us 20, I don't have an exact count, maybe it's 30, it's 40 works that he wrote over his lifetime. He was a very fruitful writer. I think in many ways it was a psychological mechanism that he employed to deal with a lot of demons that he had inside. That we're dealing with a specific novel here, Poland to Greenland. Okay, and we gave a link for purchasing an advanced copy of the English edition, meaning that I'm one of the few people to have read the English edition. So maybe those who are listening to us right now would be interested in you telling us a bit about this story and getting those who are not familiar with it sort of interested in it and captivated and get ready to pre-order.
Okay, thank you for that lead-in. I'm not going to give away too much of the plot, but what is pretty unique about this book in Aharon's oeuvre is that, so far as I know, once again, just in terms of the books that have been translated into English, This is the first novel of Applefeld's translated into English, where the main character is a Sabra, is a person who is a native-born Israeli. The other titles that I'd mentioned that were set in Israel, the main characters were Holocaust survivors who came to Israel after the war. But Yaakov Fine is an Israeli. He is the son of Holocaust survivor parents. And when the novel opens, he's in the middle of a midlife crisis. He's in his 50s. He's not happily married. He doesn't have great relationship with his two daughters, both of whom are married. And he decides that he's going to work through his midlife crisis by going to Poland, to the town that his parents came from. This is a town that he had heard a lot about growing up from his parents when they waxed nostalgic about growing up in this small town in Poland, Zdowce. And when, as a young man, he wasn't interested in any of this. He wasn't interested in his parents' background. He wasn't interested in their culture, in their spirituality, in their faith. He was very much the stereotypical first-generation Israeli, interested in his youth group and interested in his friends and interested in being an Israeli. And now in this sort of maybe not winter of his discontent, but in the spring going to winter of his discontent, he decides that he's going to make this trip to Zdowce to check out what his parents waxed nostalgic about. And when he gets there, he finds something that is completely unexpected, and I'm not going to give away any more of the plot, but he has a very life-transforming experience when he spends 2 weeks or 3 weeks in this small Russian town. So that's the plot.
I based on the title, I will say a small Polish town, but okay. So that we're talking about an individual who's at a midlife crisis. I will disagree with you. Does he emerge from this midlife crisis or not? Without spoiling things, you've advanced the theory that maybe he emerges from it. And I'll advance the possibility that maybe he doesn't, which is to take it the other way. And I guess we've got some questions set, but I'm going to push forward. So we have Applefeld dealing with, for the first time, a second generation Holocaust survivor as his protagonist, and placing this individual at the center of his work. And as you've told us, he prefers to sort of have people who are experiencing the Holocaust, or have people, children primarily, in their lives before the Holocaust, and older people and even younger people after the war. But he doesn't really have people who are experiencing it through others. So that you've situated it sort of in a different place within his corpus, and it shows an author in his mature years sort of tackling new challenges and seeing what he can do. My question, which is among the ones we've discussed before, is in what way is this still similar to the world of Aharon Applefeld, the Applefeldian world, that we might be familiar with from other novels?
Yes, Yaakov is very much an Applefeldian character, in that he's not interested in the world of his parents and his grandparents. And this is a trope that we find in Aharon's fiction, in The Man Who Never Stopped Sleeping, and in All Whom I Have Loved. He's not interested in the past. Aharon himself was the child of secular parents. The town that they lived in, Chernovitz, was not a small town, not a big town, but it was in the heart of cultural. Well, it started out in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then after World War I, it became a part of a short-lived kingdom of Romania, and then came the war. But it was in the cultural heart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Aharon was raised in that milieu. German was his mother tongue. The educated and sophisticated and cultural Jews in Chernovitz spoke German. His parents were petty bourgeois intellectuals. His grandparents, who were from the country, were in some manner observant Jews. And his parents took great care that he not be that way. But there was something that pulled him toward that, and he writes about this in his memoir, and his characters in his novels feel the same way. So this character, Yaakov Fine, is in that mold. He's based in Israel, not in Europe, but he's the child of parents who were interested in keeping the past alive, and this was not something that he was interested in. And then he decides that maybe this is a way out of his midlife crisis, and that's what makes him go to Europe to learn about his grandparents and his great-grandparents and recover some of that spirituality that he didn't get growing up as a secular Israeli and being involved in the army and being involved in his youth groups. So this is very much an Applefeldian character.
So you feel the effort sort of when there is a break with the past, that, and this is something that the protagonists have to deal with, that there's a world that they're disconnected from, that there is a desire to connect once again.
Exactly.
Okay. That it's interesting to me because I think that one of the big things within Applefeld's fiction are actually people who are trying to break with the past, and that sometimes those are the protagonists. Badenheim, which is a novel about people right before the Holocaust, is even when things are looking bad, they try to turn their eyes away from it, and they don't want to look to a world of permanent anti-Semitism, and they have a great belief in the future and progress, and their inability to see that maybe things now are like the things they were in the past. So for you, you see Yaakov's effort to reconnect as something that's important to you. I'm going to ruin some details, but that Yaakov, I'm sure you're aware, he's named for somebody in the novel.
Right. He's named for his great-grandfather. And Itchemeyer was his great-grandfather. Okay, remind me who he was named for?
Itchemeyer is his
great-grandfather.
I'm pretty sure it's just his grandfather.
Grandfather, yeah.
He's his grandfather, and Itche, for those...
Yaakov, right, it's the Yiddish version of Yaakov, Itche, yeah, right.
And so when Yaakov returns to his parents' ancestral home, or we could call it his ancestral home, does he find his connection to Itchemeyer?
Well, he's looking for it. That's what he wants. And he comes upon it, but whether he's able to make it his own, that's the question. I mean, how does this affect him? Because what's going on simultaneously with his looking for his past is encountering present day Poland, which he thought was going to be a different order of experience than it turned out to be. So there are two things that are going on here. There's his disillusionment in what he finds in Poland among the Polish Gentiles, and there's the woman with whom he boards, Magda, who knew his family, who tells him things about his ancestors that brings him closer to them. But how that, as you say, how that is going to affect him when he goes back to Israel is the great unanswered question. Well, what is this knowledge going to do for him? What part of it does is it makes him feel regret for the way that he treated his parents when his parents tried to introduce the history and culture to him, and he just completely abnegated that. He wasn't interested in his parents' method of observance. He wasn't interested in the ritual artifacts. When he has to clean out their apartment, he just tells the people, just throw everything out. I don't want anything from my parents. He didn't want to have a bar mitzvah, which broke his mother's heart. So I think that what his great realization or his great regret is the pain that he caused his parents by not being interested in all of this stuff, which he then became interested in when he heard about it from someone who was not Jewish in Poland.
Okay, so okay, and I like it. It's very interesting. I keep playing around with things. It's how much do we want to spoil for those who haven't read the text, and how much are we going to give away?
Right.
I'm going to slightly shift my questioning. We've got this story, as you've been telling us, that Yaakov Fine, you put him in his 50s. He's in a midlife crisis. And in the middle of this midlife crisis, you know, as opposed to going to Club Med, he decides to get a red sports car, he decides to go back to Poland, to his ancestral village, where he encounters new people, like many of whom knew his parents and his family for decades, and he learns directly a lot of important things from them. But this individual in a midlife crisis, this is a popular literary topic. It's also very popular in popular film or film. Do you think that he's got any connection to other writers, either in Hebrew or in world literature, that he's kind of working with when he develops Yaakov as someone who's sort of trying to work through this midlife crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a familiar trope. I mean, what do you do when you have a midlife crisis? You depart from where you are. He didn't run off with his secretary, but he went to Poland, and like I said, I'm not going to give away plot, but he kind of followed what guys in there who have midlife crises tend to do when they decamp from their home environment. So yeah, I mean, I think that he fits the picture of a guy in literature or in life having a midlife crisis. Yeah. I mean, I think Applefeld situates him right in the middle of that. Yes.
Okay, so I'm gonna give some of my ideas about this. Maybe this will pique the interest of certain people. When we do talk about movies, when we usually have a midlife crisis, you enter into it, and about halfway through the movie, we begin to find the way out and the movement forward. And for me, I like that in a movie when I'm tired in the middle of the night. Sometimes I look for a bit more complexity. And even if people aren't very good at dealing with their issues, sometimes they prove more fascinating to me. And for those who might like Kafka, Applefeld, in one of his many autobiographies, talks about Masot Beguf Rishon, which are sort of first-person essays, as I guess would be the translation. He talks about two authors who are very much important to him, and the non-Hebrew writer was Kafka. And I feel that if people are familiar with a work that Applefeld has translated called The Retreat, as well as many others, that something that I found is that we kind of begin to identify with the characters. And while Yaakov Fine has some faults, and he does some things which most people would consider questionable, he seems to have a good heart. And I would think that people kind of want someone with a good heart to find their way and to move forward. And for me, that I find this novel very difficult, because when you like people, you want things that are good for them. And for those who are more familiar with sort of mental health-based issues, the mind and the psyche are not simple things. And what I think Applefeld does in a very artistic manner is dealing with a person, maybe like me, but not like you, someone who likes to move to greater mental health and to a better situation in life, and they have peaks and valleys. And sometimes you think, oh, they finally figured it out, we're going to have a great resolution. And then you think, oh, wow, everything is great. Then all of a sudden, oh, he didn't just do that. No, did he do that? Why did he do that? Didn't he just learn something? And for me, this sort of move 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, 3 steps to the right, 2 to the left. this movement around and sort of this zigzagging in life, while we all would like to be perfect linear people who advanced and progress, I find it kind of fascinating to be with Yaakov Fine in the parts of me that I would not like to have, where I don't always make progress. I kind of screw up sometimes. And for me, that's something that, like, it's the same kind of frustration that I get when I read many of Kafka's characters. I'm just hoping that they're finally going to get it together to figure out the situation, but they never figure out what's going on. And for me, that the Kafkaesque nature of this novel, while frustrating, it's artistically wrought and realistic in its own way. So that's one person I was thinking about. But
no, I'd like to, that's a very good point. And I've got something that I'd like to share with everyone that kind of speaks to that, because you're right, the novel does end ambiguously, but most of Aharon's works end ambiguously. He's kind of the master of that. They don't get tied up into neat packages and neat bundles, and you don't walk away with a great truth resolved or a great understanding achieved. So what I'd like to read is a brief excerpt. There was a book published, not by Random House, a collection of Aharon's lectures, and it's called Beyond Despair. And it's I'm doing a human PowerPoint here. This is the book, and the lectures themselves are fascinating. But at the end, it concludes with a conversation that he had with Philip Roth in the 1980s. And Philip Roth was a great champion of Applefeld's. Irving Howe was a great champion of Applefeld's also. And so I'm just going to read something that Philip Roth says in his prefatory remarks before the conversation with Aharon. He says, his literary subject is not the Holocaust, however, or even Jewish persecution, nor to my mind is what he writes simply Jewish fiction, or for that matter, Israeli fiction. Nor, since he is a Jewish citizen of a Jewish state composed largely of immigrants, is his an exile's fiction. And despite the European locale of many of his novels and the echoes of Kafka, see, there you go, these books written in the Hebrew language certainly aren't European fiction. Indeed, all that Applefeld is not adds up to what he is, and that is a dislocated writer, a deported writer, a dispossessed and uprooted writer. Applefeld is a displaced writer of displaced fiction, who has made of displacement and disorientation a subject uniquely his own. His sensibility, marked almost at birth by the solitary wanderings of a little bourgeois boy through an ominous nowhere, appears to have been spontaneously generated a style of sparing specificity, of out-of-time progression and thwarted narrative drives that is an uncanny prose realization of the displaced mentality. So I think that says it all. That's why, that's why he's Philip Roth.
No, well, for those who are familiar with Roth, the point, Aharon Applefeld actually stars in one of Roth's novels, and it's a very funny thing for me because in the novel Operation Shylock, where there are very many Philip Roths, one of the Philip Roths encounters Aharon Applefeld, and Aharon Applefeld, the child Holocaust survivor, is depicted in that novel as being someone who is grounded and highly sane with no psychological issues. And I liked it how Roth kind of stole a bit of Applefeld and took over sort of many of the things we just heard. And I guess in certain ways, maybe in a weird way, it seems from that Roth kind of is jealous of what Applefeld has to offer, which is an interesting way of thinking about it, because Roth was very grounded in New Jersey, where I am right now, and he never seemed to leave. And then we have someone who has got a haunted landscape. That there are different ways of reading it, and if we're not like going to be completely plot driven, I I was wondering if that you had any thoughts about, so we've talked about sort of this Kafkaesque world and this world where displacement and a displaced psyche is depicted. Are there techniques or sort of motifs or things that you notice that Applefeld is employing to sort of get us into his world more effectively, into his world, which essentially would be the world of his characters?
Well, he speaks very often in his nonfiction and in interviews about his writing style, which is intentionally spare and not overflowing with adjectives, and brief and to the point, and but also elusive at the same time. And I think that's he attributes that to learning how to write in Hebrew, and that also absolutely fascinated me, because Aharon Applefeld had exactly 1 year of formal education before he was deported to the labor camp, he and his father, from which he escaped when he was 9 years old. He had a facility for languages, and that's kind of what saved his life, because he knew Ukrainian and passed himself off as a Ukrainian Gentile when he was hiding in the forest after he escaped from the labor camp at age 9. He passed himself off as a little Ukrainian boy. Then at the end of the war, he joined the Russian army and taught himself Russian. And he was a kitchen boy with the Russian army, and that got him to Italy. And from Italy, he went to Palestine. But I'm going to read from some material where Aharon talks about his relationship to Hebrew, which also, I think, talks about his writing style. He says, "The Hebrew language and taught me how to think, to be sparing with words, not to use too many adjectives, not to intervene too much, and not to interpret. If it weren't for Hebrew, I doubt whether I would have found my way to Judaism. Hebrew offered me the heart of the Jewish myth and ways of thinking and its beliefs from the days of the Bible to I've known. This is a thick strand of 5,000 years of Jewish creativity with all its rises and falls, the poetic language of the Bible, the judicial language of the Talmud, and the mystical language of Kabbalah." So that's our own style, and it's not surprising to know that what his great role model was Agnon, because that was Agnon's style as well. So I think that just speaks to his influences and speaks to how he crafted his narratives.
I mean, I agree on his sparing style and the influence of Agnon, but for those who are more familiar, Agnon is much more someone who plays with the full gamut of Hebrew texts from the Bible to the present, someone who uses all different layers of the Hebrew language. And I would assert that in his early career, Applefeld was searching for his style, and sometimes it was very complex and very opaque. And over time, he developed this sparing style, which is something which is different than Agnon. Agnon, even when he writes simply, is using a lot of different, he's citing sources and he's making a lot of allusions. So he's a bit different than the master, but that I do think that you're really keying something on, if people are going to be looking at this novel, is the issue of silence or the failure to communicate. That there's a lot of ambiguity in this text, and sort of as I get older, I'm able to understand ambiguity better. I used to be much more of a direct kind of person, but the fundamental thing, like there are techniques in this novel, if people are familiar with Flaubert, there's something called free and direct discourse, which is a technique where you kind of use the third person to talk. He was thinking about going down to the cafe for a cup of coffee. And when a narrator speaks like that, is that the third person narrator speaking, or have we entered into the thoughts of the character? And that there's a lot of use of this in the representation of Yaakov Fine. And when you use this, it's difficult to know if this is a narrator's voice evaluating things, or are we picking up on a misperception by Yaakov Fine? And this leads to this ambiguity. And this novel is filled with dreams. And dreams, while Freud might be able to solve them for us, as Joseph did back in the day, that Yaakov Fine's dreams are are really wacky. And sometimes they're kind of fun. We've talked about Yaakov being a military veteran, and he actually was an officer, and he was involved in combat activity. And one of the things that is done is when you're searching out the enemy, sometimes you just wait in ambush for them. And then you sometimes have military actions. And he talks about this in a dream. And one of the funniest things is like there can be humor when you're talking about things that are related to the Holocaust. He talks about, or he imagines in his dream that he's going to get a group of soldiers and they are going to descend on the Polish village, and they are going to take precious objects that preserve the past of 1,000 years of Jewish life in Poland back to Israel. And it's sort of a very absurd kind of dream, but for me, that it's a way of dealing with this psyche, the confused, to the right, to the left, back and forward kind of world. And there are all these fun little techniques. If you don't want the big answer, Applefeld has all these technically beautiful things, and I think that's what appealed to Roth, like he's more of a monologue kind of guy. So I just noticed some techniques that I thought were interesting. That we got a couple minutes, and I'll give you the elephant in the room question before we go on to our Q&A section, and I'm sure people have great questions for you. For many people, while I've contextualized Applefeld as an important Israeli writer, one of the most important ones, for many people, Applefeld is a Holocaust writer. And we heard Roth reject that idea. So this is a debated thing. Where do you weigh in on the question? Is this going to help us with the Holocaust in any way? Is this going to make us better people, more knowledgeable? What is the connection between Applefeld and the Holocaust?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing that you're told when you want to be a writer is write about what you know. So I think that has a lot to do with it. But I also think, and Applefeld writes about this in his memoir, once again, PowerPoint moment, story of life. And he writes about this in his fiction, is that he started writing to figure out who he was, because he didn't really have much of a sense of self, because his early years were just spent trying to stay alive and not being educated. And he comes to Israel, and this was a source of controversy. In the beginning, you talk about his first books, the story collection Smoke. He had a devil of a time trying to get that published, because people in Israel in the 1950s, they didn't want to read Holocaust stories. And he had a really hard time finding a publisher for it. And he writes in his memoir, and he writes in his fiction, that what he was told, this is a familiar trope. This is what people, especially young people who came to Israel as Holocaust survivors, were told: put this behind you. That was then, this is now. Don't think about what you lived through, because that's over and done with. And now you're in Israel. You're an Israeli. You're a Muslim Jew. You're a new kind of citizen of the world, and you don't need to think about it. You don't need to process that anymore. You don't need to put that. And he rebelled against that. And that was the source of his writing. He started writing because he needed to figure out who he was, and how he fit into the universe, and what to do with the things that he remembered, or the things that he thought he remembered, or the things that came to him in dreams that maybe he experienced and maybe he didn't. And writing was his way of working through that. And eventually Israel caught up with him. I mean, in the beginning, people weren't interested in what he had to write about, but then the next generation was, and that's when he became the beloved figure that he became, because the generation after his generation was interested in what living through the Holocaust does to you as a person, and what kind of an Israeli that makes you, and what kind of lessons does that have for people who were born in Israel and who did not experience that. So, I mean, I think that's, where quote unquote Holocaust writer comes from, is Aharon just trying to work through his own personal experiences and figuring out who he is as an Israeli and what being an Israeli means to him.
I think I'm gonna sum, because at certain points Sydney's probably going to want us to move on to the question and answer. But that I find that to be a really beautiful way to think about things, and I thank you for. I'm someone who's had to think about that question, and you've given me a new way to think about it. The difficulties publishing his first collection, Smoke, is, I figure many in the audience know, that in the 1950s, this is before the Eichmann trial, and Eichmann was still in South America. And when he went on trial in Israel, this was an international sensation, and it was the first time that really the Israeli public as opposed to a small group in a kitchen or a home at a specific day to remember people, they began to deal with issues of the Holocaust. And Applefeld wasn't afraid to deal with these and point out that there were people who were irreparably harmed by that and damaged by these experiences. But for me, that the Holocaust, we can just look at the negative, but I think you've taken us in a much more positive direction. That Applefeld is a young child trying to survive in the forests on the outskirts with the whores and the horse thieves and all the other people. He was very afraid to ever let anything go. And he talks about himself sort of being descended close to being an animal, and that he was just trying to survive. And in this way, he was erased as a human being, and he was erased as a Jew. And that this is sort of the most horrible thing about the Holocaust, people losing their identity and losing their humanity. And if we think about Applefeld's literary career, he's moving away from this erasure, and the very act of writing and learning about who he is and learning about Judaism for maybe 100 or 150 years before his experiences, and then taking it into the eve of the 21st century and thinking about the varieties of Jewish experience, and even embracing those who might not be so lovable, like the immortal Bartfuss, just to name one of many not so lovely individuals, that he's bringing them onto the map and sort of giving Jewish experience, and through it sort of representing representing his world, and sort of a rich Jewish world, not everything that people would like, but this sort of writing and moving beyond the erasure that the Holocaust in many ways represents. So I think that's a very lovely way to think about him, as sort of a Holocaust writer who is trying to transcend the message of the Holocaust. I think we're about at the time that we're supposed to shift over. So we've got some questions. Here, I'm going to start with some, which is more of we want to know about the person, and then we'll go for a couple for you. And a very simple one: did Applefeld have children?
Yes, 3. Two sons and a daughter. And in fact, he did a wonderful, once again, PowerPoint moment. He did an incredibly beautiful book with his son, Meir. Meir is an artist. And he did a book that was basically a love song to Jerusalem called Table for One. And it was about the cafes that he loved in Jerusalem, where he used to sit and write. And it's accompanied by images, by Meir's images. And it is the most, we didn't publish it, but commercial for Toby Press. Yes, it's an incredibly beautiful book, and it's beautiful because in it, Aharon writes about his love of Jerusalem. So it's beautiful on a lot of different levels.
So I just, because people have this thing that Holocaust survivors are tortured, but I encountered him in Jerusalem. He was a very sweet man who could tell some very funny jokes, and he had children, and he was a loving person. So the Holocaust did not stop people from loving. To take it in a more sort of professional direction, you're editing a book by a man who's no longer alive, and what kind of challenges are there for editing a book in translation?
It's enormously challenging when the author is no longer alive. Um, this was the first book of Aharon's. No, it was the second book that I edited after his passing, and um, he would work with the translator, and then I'd get the manuscript, and then I'd do my edits, and then he would go over my edits. So this was very much a partnership, and it was just devastating to me. And I would just try to keep his voice in my ear when I was doing what I was doing. And Judith has been a terrific partner. That's his widow. And I sent her my material, and it was sort of like going over with Aharon. In fact, she has a slightly better command of the English language, I think, than Aharon did. So I did have her. But it was just incredibly bittersweet, because that was one of the great joys of working on Aharon's books, was the give and take that we had when he would be going over my edits, and that's gone. And the same thing with the translator, with the Stuart Schaffman. He delivered his translation and he died, and I didn't have him to bounce things off of either. So this was very bittersweet experience for me. But I just, I hope that they are, in the Olam HaEmet where they are now, I hope that they are pleased with the result.
No, I mean, it is wonderful if the editor can already have the author's voice in their head, and that's to have an experience. No, I mean, when you work with someone for a long time, you know how to respond, and that it's really, it's very meaningful to hear that, you respect the dead and you're trying to give their voice to things. Before, there are a number of really great questions, but since you already brought up the translator, Stuart Schaffman, this is a question that is kind of interesting. Why is the book being translated now? Because Applefeld, and when his books are written and translated, is a mystery, and maybe you can give us a sense of how the world of publishing functions.
Well, he was incredibly prolific, and I just couldn't keep up with him. That was the problem. And which book went next? Well, it was basically a conversation between Aharon and his literary agent and me. So that was how we decided. It was, and not in any particular order. They would give me a plot summary of the most recent novels, and I would say, okay, let's go with this one. So, and that was really how it worked. And as I said, it's really hard for me to keep up with him because he was so prolific. But that's how we decided it.
So that in a certain way that you had the opportunity at all times to look through a couple of different ones, and you could think about, wow, this will capture an audience, and maybe if it was done 10 years ago, I'll still get it. And this one from 2 years ago, yeah, we can do it, but maybe it'll be number 3 on the list. So you had a lot of interesting things. Here's one for those who are sort of, through our conversation, getting into the Applefeldian world. Someone asked about the character, and hopefully we'll get to that a bit more. The question is, what is your favorite Applefeld book?
That's like asking who my favorite child is.
I mean, we're not doing Sophie's Choice here. You don't need to sacrifice one of them. No one needs to die. It's just an ordering. Okay.
Oh gosh, this is hard. I mean, the favorite Applefeld book that I didn't publish, once again, PowerPoint.
Modesty. Very good.
Was Badenheim. That I think is his masterwork, and that was the one that put him on the map here in the United States. It was published in 1980 by David R. Godine, a very small literary publisher, and it was just discovered by Irving Howe, who reviewed it in the New York Times, and that was that set Aharon off for his career here in the United States. So that, and I don't know, I just, of the ones that I've edited, I mean, I'm gonna, this is a commercial moment, so I'm gonna do it. PowerPoint moment. The first book we published was The Iron Tracks, which I love. And then we published The Conversion, which I also loved. We did then The Memoir, which I loved. Then we did Blooms of Darkness. I love them all. The Man Who Never Stopped Sleeping.
See, the person who asked this question, the answer is Altie likes Applefeld, and it's not going to be discerning. I'm just going to pitch in because I'm just going to give, as the younger folk would say, I give a shout out to a couple of titles that I kind of like. The one that is pretty famous is Torah Plot, An Age of Wonders, and I feel that David Godine Publishers published that a couple of years later. And this is famous because in many ways it is the unique Applefeld way of sort of touching upon the Holocaust and not touching upon the Holocaust. It's a novel that takes place until the war, and then it takes back up after the war. And people asked Applefeld many times about where's the Holocaust in this? And in the Hebrew edition, I don't know if it's in the English edition, there's a blank page in the middle. And he would open up the book and he would point to the blank page and he would say, this is the Holocaust. And if we talk about those who talk about the inability to express the Holocaust, that in certain ways, even as he got more and more in touch with more direct aspects of the Holocaust, he questioned the ability to effectively do so. And it's a very wonderful opening and sort of heart-wrenching section. They come together as one. And I mentioned they're not all published, but I kind of like his first collection, Smoke, which they're really beautiful short stories that really show him sort of part of an avant-garde that was emerging in Israel. And while people don't imagine him together with Sabras like Amos Oz and Aleph Bet Yoshua, I feel that he belongs there. So that's mine, but people pick up a book and see what works for you. Libraries have lots of it if you don't want to do the financial investment. Here's one that takes us more back and shifts things. Could you discuss more about what characterizes an Applefeldian character?
Well, yeah. That this is a person who feels that the past isn't important, but then realizes that it is important when this character feels that there's something missing from their life and they can't quite figure out what it is. And then they realize it's the fact that they have negated their past. I think that just kind of sums it up. His characters are raised to believe that the past isn't important, that contemporary culture, Gentile culture, we can blend in with Gentile. These are all set pre-World War II. That what's important is the music and literature of the culture that surrounds us, of the Germanic culture that surrounds us, and then this character feels that there's something missing from their lives, and then they discover, 5,000 years of Jewish literature and culture and religion, and then realize that's what was missing. That's the Applefeldian character.
Okay, I'm thinking about the question too. Not that Altie's wrong, that I'm probably wrong too. This is like pin a tail on the donkey when you've got the blindfold. For me, the Applefeldian character I was talking about Yaakov Fine as someone who's got ups and downs and he's going forward and backwards. I feel someone with limited consciousness that is not fully aware of their surroundings, which in many ways is all of us, is the typical Applefeldian character. And just to shift off from these, another famous novella, which is widely available, is called Tzili, which is about a young woman in hiding during the war who is she arrives at, she's got everything, folks. That Tzili is a young woman discovering herself both intellectually and sexually. And it's a coming of age story where someone doesn't really understand how they're coming of age. So for me, there's something attractive about it. While I'd like to be completely in control of the situation at all times and understand everything, Applefeld and his Applefeldian characters help me realize that we're not always clued into what's going on around us, and sort of our limited consciousness as individuals. It's a problem, but it's human, and so we need to accept it. and love flawed people. And so for me, that's something that is typical. But to try to move on and get to other things, here's another, simple 1 minute kind of answer question, or you can write a book, you can decide. How did Applefeld change as a writer over time?
That's a really good question. Gosh. I think he felt more comfortable writing about the horrors that he personally experienced through a fictional lens. In the beginning, that wasn't what he wrote about. That wasn't the subject of Badenheim. That wasn't the subject of To the Land of the Cattails. But I think that as he grew more comfortable in his skin as a writer, and as he sort of thought through himself as a person and as a Holocaust survivor, I think he felt slightly more comfortable writing about his love. He never wrote about his experience in the labor camp. I don't know if it's because he didn't remember it all that well, but he did. And at one point, I think in some interview, he was asked if he's ever going to write a memoir, and he said no. But then he did write The Story of a Life, which is sort of kind of a memoir. And I think that how he changed over the years is that he felt more comfortable talking about the time that he spent as an animal-like existence in the wood, and the time that he spent working for a prostitute, and the time that he spent working for thieves, and he felt more comfortable. I think I saw that as an evolution.
No, I would agree with you. I just, you got a couple minutes, and people are letting me talk, so I'm going to talk. I think that as a writer, he went through a lot of different stages. And in his earliest stage, he was dealing with Holocaust survivors he was noticing in places like Jerusalem, and he felt that they deserved representation. And he sort of projected some of his own issues onto them, but it was very much here and now. And one of the things that he gradually developed is he moved, like Badenheim 1938, it deals with German Jews in somewhat stereotypical fashion, but it was beginning of expanding the kinds of themes and characters that he brought in. He gradually took over the world of his grandparents, which are the Jews of the Carpathians, who are very religious, and capturing their world. And I think that he moves forward into the 19th century at certain points, and deals with people who've converted. And he began to recreate the world of Eastern European Jewry, both religious and non-religious. And this is very monumental, and it took a lot of work on his part. And then I think that Altie really nailed it with, as he became much older, he sort of was able, after this long experience, to start going closer to his own actual experience within fiction. And he deals with, in certain ways, I would argue, he deals with his own assimilated parents, disconnected from Judaism. And as opposed to returning to them with anger, he returns to them with understanding. And his efforts to connect with his parents and their experiences, even though they had been through a lot, it actually makes him a healthy person in most people's eyes, not just Philip Roth's. And that he begins to mention details of the Holocaust, which really are discomforting. And it's something that he didn't used to do. But as opposed to leaving us feeling that the Holocaust is a rupture that we can never overcome, he enters into this world to find sort of love and connection and empathy. And that, is there something to take away? I think there's a deep humanism in his writing. It's artistically raw. So if you like things that are beautiful, it's good, but that he was a loving individual. And I think he, in the end, has a message of love. And in these days and time, that's actually something very meaningful, because I think we're not in a time where love is pushed forward and hatred moves people apart. I think we are at 7 p.m. I don't know if they're going to kick us off of the Zoom link, but I figure that our moderator, Sydney, is going to arrive soon. Here she is. So I hand things over to her.
Well, I want to thank you both so much. This conversation has been so fascinating to listen to. And I have learned so much about Applefeld and his writing. And I'm really excited to go back and revisit some of his stuff kind of with fresh eyes. So thank you both for that.